Want to take just a moment. One of the things we keep doing, or we've done over the past few weeks now, is just to have a kind of an icebreaker conversation. And so I've been asking a single question and getting folks' response to that. And today, the single word question today is community. So Stephen, I'll start with you. When you hear the word community, what's that sound? What's that come up to, or what's that make you think of?
Well, I think the first word that came to my mind was people. And then when I think about why, I think about shared experiences. And really that's where it boils down to for me. Despite despite or in spite of differences, I think that the shared experience of any type is what creates a community, or a sense of community.
Tom, you want to add to that? I think you're on mute.
Yes, when we talk about communities, to me, a community is basically a series of organizations that typically work together to share limited resources, and so when I look at this throughout all my engagements, my communities can be anywhere from 6 little townships, which comprise a school district, could be a county, or it could be in some cases up to 3 counties. So my definition of communities are basically any of those factions. As long as they're all working together, as long as we can all round up and communicate, that's a community for me.
Yeah, I get the opportunity to think about this for a while as I was kind of putting some of these things together for today, and thinking about community, and we talk about community a lot, Tom, you and I, and Connected Nation, and so often it is this idea of a small group of folks, but community, it can be a large area, a large group of folks totally disconnected by geography for that matter. And so sometimes I think we tend to fall into this idea of a geographic area or a region. But in reality, it's like-minded folks focused on a general cause. Sometimes that is a geography, but there's community really encompasses so many different things, and I think it's important nomenclature. It's one of the reasons we use it, because it does cover so many different facets of our lives. Community does, and ultimately relationships. And so much of the work that Connected Nation Michigan does is based on relationships and helping really kind of grow relationships at the local level, or regional level, and even state and federal level. And so it was a good question. I thought it was a good word for us to start off on today, as we kind of take a look at a geography that we don't talk about all too often. Certainly one that we do discuss and that we work in, but just not one that we speak on quite as often as maybe we should. And so first, Stephen, if you don't mind, I would just ask, do you mind to kind of give an idea or give us an overview of the work that you do, and how, what that role looks like on a day-to-day basis?
Sure. So my organization represents 5 communities, or 5 counties in West Michigan: Lake, Mason, Muskegon, Oceana, and Newaygo. And our program areas are funded by state, local, and federal funds. So we're extremely diverse, and our main responsibility is to serve the local units of government who enable us to exist, basically. My responsibilities are in the economic development and local government services program areas. We also have transportation planning, environmental planning, and I also dabble in hazard mitigation. So our main focus is to help local communities fulfill state and federal planning requirements, and basically bring resources to the communities that we serve.
And Tom, I think you've worked with Stephen now in at least a handful of communities. I know I've been on a call or two where I saw his name pop up over the past several weeks. You care to kind of talk about some of the work that you do locally and regionally with Stephen?
Sure. Stefan and I, we cooperate. We've cooperated a lot in the past several years here on community engagement. So we work with several of the counties. Matter of fact, I think I've worked in all but one of the counties that Stefan is, his region's in charge of, his jurisdiction there. And Dan Manning happens to have the other community technology advisor has been actively working in the other one. But we've been working together on a lot of different projects. We've launched the Connected program several times, but also we've become a source of information. We're kind of the broadband go-to people for a lot of our regions. And so when we have new activities coming up, such as some of these COVID programs, especially like RDOF and the reverse auction, quite often we go before the board of directors or EDC groups, economic development groups there, and inform them of what's going on. And then in a lot of cases, we even bring the providers to the table to talk about their bill plans, and then also their issues. That's the big thing. We look at the schedules, and Stefan's right there next to us in those meetings. And so when a provider says, I have problems getting permits in this county, Stefan's one of the people I lean on. He knows how to grab those right people and bring them to the table. And so we can have those discussions, because people need the broadband. And sometimes they don't realize that they're their own worst enemy here. So we need to resolve those issues. So thank you. It's good working with people like him.
And I want to remind the audience today too that throughout today, if you've got questions for any of us, please use the Q&A option. It should be at the lower portion of your screen. Just drop your questions in there. We'll try to ask those as we move through this, and we'll have some time at the end to ask questions and get some answers from our panelists as well. Moving along, Stephan, in your experience, what are some of the biggest differences between like regional planning efforts and more localized community-based planning, community or county-based planning projects?
To me, it's the ability to implement. Really, that's the biggest difference. Regional agencies have access to networks and resources and expertise, but we can only do so much. It really has to, when it comes to implementing initiatives or projects, the impetus has to really come from the local level. So regions are a very valuable source of information and support, but it really comes down to having a local champion on whatever cause it may be to carry the torch and move a project forward. So really that's the biggest difference.
Tom, kind of from your perspective, from the Connected Nation Michigan perspective, and working with both counties or communities and then regions, how might you kind of respond to what the biggest differences are in those types of projects?
Well, as Stephan said, they have a lot of expertise in a lot of several areas, and a lot of the rural communities they work with. Even though we've got smart people in those communities, like the one I live in, we're small and we all wear 12 hats. So it's important. They bring a lot of expertise in a lot of different areas. And so it's recognizing that and working with the COGs, the regions, to bring in and start working on projects that they can handle. And also, when we make these recommendations, I'll just say too, is we have to make sure we're all inclusive too of all the communities. We don't want to be making recommendations that separate out, or they don't take care of this community versus that community. That just kind of creates problems for everybody. So especially the Council of Governments. I will say, when I start an engagement in a certain region, cold, the first thing I do is I reach out to the Council of Governments, whether it's Michigan, Texas, Ohio, wherever I'm working. I start there because they understand what's going on the ground, and they help me, round up the cats and start bringing people to the table. So that's one of my keys. So.
Yeah. So, Tom, I'm going to ask too, what do you think are maybe the biggest benefits from a kind of looking at broadband planning work what do you think maybe some of the biggest benefits are for regional planning when you compare those with, just a community or county based, and maybe it's not a one or the other, but where, leveraging regional resources really, helps out with that local or even more local planning process?
Yeah, it's like I said, tapping into those local resources, and some of the recommended actions that we look at are right up our best handled at a regional basis because of all the expertise. One of the good examples we looked at is, and Wes, you've been on those projects too, with vertical asset inventories, and where you just can't pick on, and they've got the GIS departments to help you out, and those are some of the things. Another thing too is we look at local policies and ordinances, and we find out in a lot of rural communities that those regional governments actually help the local communities when they update their master plans, which is ideal time to update the communication ordinances and the permitting process. So it's using that expertise on large projects that are then in a lot of cases where the smaller communities just can't get it done.
Stephen, are there some specific broadband or technology needs that you hear from communities in your region that you believe can be more easily addressed at a regional level versus the community or county level?
That's a really, really tough question to answer. It really is, because not one size does not fit all. Mm-hmm. Especially with the broadband needs, community to community, industry to industry. So yeah, that's in my experience, that's been one of the big challenges, is to find the common denominator that we can tackle on a regional or multi-jurisdiction. It doesn't have to be a big region. It could just be a multi-jurisdictional, two communities. I mean, anything that we can do that can make it easier to move the ball forward, because there's so many units of government and so many don't have resources. So that's really part of our challenge is to bring that support and make everything a little bit easier to move things forward.
Tom, I know that you have seen it in the past, and I know I've heard providers make mention of it as well, but the idea of working as a community has some streamlining effect for a provider, or when you look at the build out of broadband service or even just the expansion. And oftentimes, one of the things that we'll hear from a provider is that, a single community down the road can slow or completely hinder expansion and deployment of service to the next community down the road. And I don't remember what webinar I was on. It's been probably within the past 6 months, I know, but a provider, said, it's fun on Friday night for us, for the communities, to have our rivalries on the football field, or maybe hockey or pick your sport. But when it comes to technology and broadband expansion, we need to work together, because one community can really halt or slow down the expansion. And those seem to be important things for us to keep in mind. I know organizationally, Connected Nation Michigan, we think about that as we try to expand, and we always are looking at the bigger picture. Why might a community not have access to specific resources? Anything you would add to that, Tom, given the experience you've had in the field?
Yeah, I've seen this several occasions where there'll be there's differences between, say, the county road commission and the provider, and then all of a sudden you run into a stalemate, and the permitting, the build out is held up. And I've had a couple of those instances actually happen the last few years where provider, a county's getting built out, but then issues with the road commission, and then the next two counties to the north and the counties to the east, the two counties there, they should be being built out this year, and right now the two counties, the provider and the one county, they're resolving that issue. And so even during, especially during COVID, so we see that, and I've seen that before, and also where delays, folks could have had broadband at Christmas time, but because of those delays in July, that service doesn't show up until, later on in the spring. So yeah, we've seen that several occasions, and it's good to work with those communities and those counties and let them understand the importance of what they're doing, and we got to resolve these issues as soon as possible. That's important.
Tom, you talked about that, and even as I was asking and kind of talking through that question a little bit, and we started off with the conversation of community this morning, but identifying community is step one to the work that we do, regardless of the geography, right?
Right.
And so in a region, and as you mentioned, you often go to Council of Governments to get started. But fully identifying what community means for the geography that you're working in or that you're trying to make an impact on is really, really important, because then once you can identify everyone, then you can try to include everyone in that process. And so, hopefully that helps eliminate some of the kinds of issues that you're talking about, that I was mentioning, because if we understand what the community really is, and we're inclusive in that definition, I think we begin to have more of an impact. And so, even at a regional kind of view, it's more people, but the community expands, but the same types of roles and players exist in that kind of community engagement. We did have just have a question in, and Tom, I'll lean this one your direction, but
Sure.
Are there regulations that require the broadband providers to deploy service in hard to serve areas? Example, rural, low income, minority.
There's no hard regulations, but I will say that there are a lot of funding programs that are out there right now. And once the providers, such as the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund or the CAF2 phase, which are still active. So once a provider goes into contract and gets a subsidy to build out that area, they are required to build out in those areas. And that's what the government is using is the subsidy, kind of like that, waving that golden carrot out there and trying to make that final return on investment case. And so in a lot of cases with the FCC, like in the recent RDOF, you've seen where some of the areas, the FCC only put out maybe 25% of the build, and in other areas, maybe 39% of the build. So where the provider has the majority of the investment, has a lot of skin in the game, they still have those obligations, and they're tightly scheduled too. They're monitored in the payments, the progressive payments. So if they don't meet those obligations, they don't get paid. So yes, that's how that's done.
Yeah, I was going to say, and I would add there are those build out requirements, and now there are there's actually a financial impact for not completing a build out or a committed area. And so that's essentially the cost of the money that will be supplied for that area, as well as essentially interest on those areas over time. And so, the line for where it makes sense or doesn't make sense is a lot lower on our current funding programs than it has been in the past, where I think most providers are going to recognize the need to try to build as much as they committed. Obviously, in every situation, you may get into a one-off where a household or a home or a business that's farther away or is more difficult to reach than expected, and it could be a different kind of situation. But ultimately, the funding comes with stipulations. The new funding comes with stipulations to make that happen. But general regulation for build out is, this doesn't exist for providers. Got a couple of other questions. We'll go ahead and try to take a look at here. There was a question about where can we monitor the success of build outs that were just mentioned as far as the current funding. Those sites aren't currently up yet. So the funding hasn't quite hit the hands of a lot of the providers. I think that's still over the next several weeks, months here before the providers will end up with some of the funding. And then we should expect that the federal government will then stand up sites where, number one, where those providers have to report where the funding is going to, and that'll be by household or address location. And then, at that point, similar to what we saw with the Connect America Fund, or at least we assume that it'll probably be something similar to that. You'll be able to go on to that map and zoom in, and you'll begin to see locations where providers have been building out and committing those funds to the ground. All right. Stephen, what's your, in your opinion, when it comes to regional broadband planning, is there a particular priority that you think exists for your region as far as what needs to be done, or, should it be like this holistic kind of response, or should it be very much, kind of prescriptive, particularly given that we have new federal funding and different, even state dollars that are being built out in your regions? From a regional perspective, do you think it needs to be this kind of holistic response, or do we need to become more and more prescriptive about how we're, focused on various different areas of unserved or underserved broadband?
Well, I could go in any number of directions with that question. And I'll start by saying that this is a rather unique issue where everybody agrees we need broadband, right? So everybody agrees. But I think one of the first steps is to, in having this conversation, is educating, and I don't know if it's leveling expectations or helping frame expectations of what it is and how it's accomplished, because that's one of the first steps, one of the first hurdles. And then one thing that I've come to over and over is that, well, one size does not fit all. So it has to be, the approaches have to be tailored depending on the situation. So it's definitely a hands-on process. It's not a cookie cutter. Unfortunately, it's not there's no playbook. So removing barriers is one role that regions can play in bringing players to the table, and helping work with local communities to on the permitting and on improving the granularity of information at the local level, the maps, the service data that can be then used to inform the private sector investments. So,
Stephen, before we jumped on this morning, before we were having technical difficulties, you and I had kind of begun to have this conversation that the broadband in and of itself is sometimes, it's a very complicated subject. The deployment is, because of various different things, the economics and finances behind it, and who needs what speeds. We all need X speed, whatever the kind of public outcry may be at any given point. And yet, oftentimes it's been handled in a very oversimplified manner because it is so complicated. And, Connected Nation Michigan, one of the things we want to do is simplify the process and demystify the conversation, which is very much what Tom spends a lot of his time working with communities and regions, for that matter, trying to do, is to bring, this, as you mentioned, education and awareness around the services and what they do. But oftentimes it's also a matter of trying to bring or level set what services, what it takes to bring service to your community, right? And so oftentimes we talk about the equation of bringing broadband service to a community. We talk about access, adoption, and use, and access obviously is that supply side, but the demand side as well. And so are there things that a region or a community can do to change the equation to make it easier for a provider to come into the community? And obviously with funding mechanisms that are in place right now that we're starting to see, I think it becomes easier for providers. But it's obviously something we can't forget, is that demand side, the adoption and use side of that equation. And so, where we can to begin to kind of demystify and begin to bring more clarity to a community or region, what needs to be done or what people are wanting to do with a broadband connection becomes important. So it's exciting to hear you talk about education, because you all have the opportunity to filter that down, from a regional to a more local perspective. Tom, you want to talk for a moment maybe about single points of contact and the importance of that, maybe both at a community level, but also within a region?
The single points of contact is really critical, especially for the providers. Like when we talked about some of the issues that happen, permitting problems. and also, and it works a couple different ways. A single point of contact, all of a sudden you're going to find out we got a new factory coming into town. We've got a new housing development coming into town. That person needs to be the providers need that one person to reach out to, and so that they can start transferring that information back between the provider world and the community to keep both sides informed of what's going on, and then also the issues. And quite often, if you run into, say, a permitting problem, that single point of contact is really critical, both at the regional and also at the local level. And so it's hard. It's kind of a hard job sometimes. It's hard to find that particular person that is willing to do that, but they do play a critical role. And I think with all the build outs we're seeing right now and all the issues with RDOF and everything else, and with COVID, I think they're even more important now than what they have been in the past. So yeah, that one single person that you can is this, like I said, the single point of contact. Very, very, very simple explanation for that.
Yeah, going through and looking, we've got several questions that have come in. You know, some of these, admittedly, for folks who have sent questions, some of them will best be answered simply by sending you emails and resources, you know, for individual communities or counties that are interested. There was a question, though, with our work with COGS and regional agencies, could we point to COGS or regional agencies that are best practices with respect to broadband? And I know, Tom, you have worked with, as have I, the Northeast Michigan Council of Governments. They've been watching this and making steps towards making their region more and more accessible to broadband providers to bring services. That's an oversimplified version of the work that they've done. Tom, would you want to expand on that?
Yeah, they were very motivated. Kind of the nickname up there in Northeast Michigan is called the Dark Continent. A lot of people call it because of the lack of broadband. And Stephen's got some areas in his communities are very similar. So, but yeah, they, you know, working together, I think both Stephen's Council of Governments and Northeast, I think they collaborate quite a bit. They communicate back and forth, both directors I know. And so you see a lot of similarities in the programs they're launching. And the vertical assets inventory, and recently with all the COVID, some of this extra COVID money I thought was interesting. They want to leverage this COVID funds. And so they actually taken some of these funds and provided grant writing support to some of the local communities, which has been fantastic. So a lot of communities, there's a lot of funding out there available, but they just don't have the expertise or time. And so at the COG level, they have this expertise, and they've been, like I said, utilizing some of those COVID funds that they're receiving and using it as a multiplier effect to bring more funding and more infrastructure into their communities.
Stephen, would you want to add to that?
No, I agree. That's one of the main supporters or vehicles for my efforts is the CARES Act funding that we received through EDA, and a portion of our non-competitive planning grant is dedicated towards broadband. And admittedly, going into this, that was very vague because there are so many nuances to this issue. And so we're basically learning as we go and helping out where we can. And a lot of that has to do with the support we have received through EDA to do that.
Stephen, would you want to, with Tom having just talked about the vertical asset work that's been done, one of the things that I think we can, we'll begin to see that'll help, that has a trickle down. It starts with the state, trickles out even to what's happening with our regions, but absolutely in our communities, is the new Dig Once, the infrastructure portal. You want to talk about the infrastructure portal for a moment?
Sure. I'm going to hit send on my chat right there. I had it waiting to go. I'm very relieved that this press release came out today. We've been waiting for this announcement for what seems like years, but it's been a couple of weeks. this is an effort from the state level. The Michigan Infrastructure Council has put together a project portal, and I'm not going to try to explain it too much. It's really right there in the press release, but basically it's a vehicle for coordinating infrastructure projects, and with the bottom line of making them more efficient and affordable, not only for communities, but for providers, utilities, basically infrastructure providers. And it just makes so much sense to coordinate investments, both public and private. So at the regional level, we are going to be promoting this to our local units. And we're really hopeful that this is going to kind of usher in a new era of asset management. Mm-hmm. And it's closely related to broadband and the fact that, you know, the dig once policy. I mean, if we can coordinate broadband infrastructure with road projects, and we can reduce barriers, any barrier that we can eliminate is going to help the greater good.
I can add to that. You know, from the provider world is pretty excited about this, and so you know, they're at, in some estimates, some have estimated that, you know, the cost savings, you know, once a trench is open, you know, they just love to go in and lay down the conduit with fiber, and they're looking at it. Some of them have estimated as high as a 30% savings. So they're very excited about this, and I think when this was put on hold for a while, it was a little bit disappointing for some of them. But yes, it's a very important thing, and this is going to be a big move for the state of Michigan. And I'm hoping some of the other states we're working in will follow suit at some point too. I think a lot of people will be watching this. So.
Yeah, it's you know, when we talk with providers, or just even when we talk with folks in general about the services that they receive, you know, it becomes evident that there's all types of infrastructure needed, and broadband has the opportunity to piggyback in the need of that infrastructure. I end up spending several hours every time we do one of these webinars speaking with folks who have questions or ideas and thoughts and so on and so forth. And one of those more recent conversations was in an area, fairly rural area in the western part of the state, where there's service there, but they're limited by essentially the backhaul going to their provider. And it's almost a desert. It really is a desert where they're at as far as getting additional infrastructure in there. And so with the coordination of all infrastructure projects and the opportunity to know and be notified about, you know, when the ground's going to be open, or when new roads are being built or whatnot, it may absolutely have an increase or increase those opportunities for our communities and the providers who are even exist now, to gain greater access to the, you know, infrastructure and the backhaul that they need to serve customers throughout the state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One thing I would like to add is that it's a voluntary effort right now. So we're going to be working hard to encourage our local municipalities to participate, because it will be not as effective unless both utilities and communities participate. And I will also add that the system has been kind of kickstarted with federal aid eligible road projects. So that's kind of where we're starting. And then we're hoping to get infrastructure managers of all types to jump on, and the more, the better.
All right, we're kind of getting close here to the end. Again, I know there's several questions that we haven't addressed online. A lot of them, though, are really focused on getting some additional contact and making some introductions. Tom, you'll see a few of those, I'm sure. Okay. If there's any additional questions, now's the time to put those in there. Either of you have anything you'd want to kind of, that maybe we haven't talked about, that you'd want to bring up today before we get ready to jump off?
Yeah, you know, I know broadband's a huge issue, and believe me, there's nothing worse than spending an hour on a phone conversation with a school superintendent this summer. You know, how am I going to get broadband to my kids? You know, so I will say this much. You know, we try to be as honest and straightforward about the reality of the situation here and what's happening, but you know, people got to realize that demand on the internet for a lot of the providers, you know, it's increased overnight 30%. And we're seeing a lot of things now, Zoom and a lot of activities, we've been pushing teleworking for a long time. And now I think a lot of people are going to stay teleworking. One of the comments made the other day is, guess what? 1930 just showed up real quick. So that's one of the common things that we're looking at. But also, you know, with telemedicine is another big one too, working with the hospitals. And so working with the local, they call them now digital health teams. And so that someday somebody like me, you know, with gray hair, we're going to wake up in the morning, there's going to be a monitor there and it's going to put your hand on, it's going to check your vitals and say, hey, go play, Tom. Or it's going to say, Tom, open the door, you get ambulances on the way in 5 minutes. So you need to get you to the hospital real quick. Those are the kind of things that broadband's needed for. And we're dealing with a lot of those issues. You know, there's a big labor shortage, there's material shortage, and also there's permitting issues, you know, choke points too. So I think in Stephenson's area, we had one provider that because of a permitting issue, we had about 8,000 of his residents and businesses this year were scheduled to be hooked up. Now they're not going to be. They're going to be delayed a year. So there's a lot of people. The demand is huge, and it's really pushing the infrastructure and pushing our systems out there right now. But we'll get through it. We're working through it one by one.
Stephanie, anything you'd want to add? Oh, go ahead.
I would just real quickly add a couple of my recent experiences and just my perspective from the region, and is identifying or recruiting or educating a local champion is critical. It's at that point of contact that you're talking about. Not only that point of contact, but somebody who can spread the gospel within the community, really. So it's a two-way street from that respect. And then also just something that came up very recently for me is in attempting to start this conversation, it's important to differentiate between access and adoption, because we're starting to work in Muskegon County, and whereas up until now, most of my efforts have been dedicated to the rural areas where access is the biggest issue. Now in Muskegon County, there's rural and urban, and it's going to be critical for us to differentiate and kind of divide and conquer our efforts in those two areas. So that's just what we're kind of facing right now.
Stephen, that's a great way to add on. And I know Tom and I both appreciate that, because that's the conversation that we have so often. You know, we talk the three words: access, adoption, and use. And certainly, and fortunately, we've seen federal funding recently for the adoption and use side. You know, we talk about the emergency broadband benefit that's out there to help folks who maybe can't afford the services that are available. Hopefully, services available. And then there's this new emergency broadband benefit. I think we've got a few providers on. I'm going to take the moment to encourage you to sign up to be to serve in the emergency broadband benefit, because it truly will help so many people who may have who are struggling to afford broadband. This, it's $50 a month to help them afford the services that they need. And ultimately, one of the concerns that we have as we look at it is that is that if there's a provider, number one, if there's not a provider, we have an access issue. But if there's a provider there and they don't participate or don't sign up to participate in that program, then those individuals won't be able to partake in that process as well. And so certainly we want to see as many providers as we can signed up for that program, helping get access or helping get adoption and use up and bring cheaper, more affordable services for folks that really need it. And Tom, you brought up, the need to telework, and that was some of the questions that's driving some of the questions that we have in here today. Just being able to get out into their community. Since COVID, they've needed to telework, and obviously telehealth is huge. And everything's going to look different over the next 5 to 10 years as far as how we access our various different services. And it seems as though every service that hasn't already gone online or digital is seeking ways to make their services available in some sort of digital format. And so it becomes more and more important that our networks, that we have the networks we need, and that they can handle the kind of traffic that we would expect to see over the next, however many years. And so I think it will continue to be an unpredictable amount of traffic over time. Duplications, just many, many more times throughput necessary than what we've even seen in over the past year is probably what we're looking at for the next, however many years. With that, we want to thank everybody for all their questions today. Gentlemen, Stephen, Tom, really want to thank you all for taking time today to talk. Regional planning is one way to look at this, but I think ultimately it's kind of a trickle down kind of process where at the regional level, you all have tools and resources to help at a local level be leveraged and use those to make a big difference. And ultimately, we're going to, like you said, Stephen, it's not going to be a one size fits all. One thing may work well in one area that won't work well in another. And so we look forward to being able to pursue those kind of regional and local planning efforts. Tom, Stephen, thank you. Thank you to everyone today. And we'll be back in a couple of weeks with another webinar. Goodbye.
Bye. Be safe.